I'm Jenna Seery, a bookseller and associate producer of Poured Over, and today I am so excited to be joined by Alisa Alering to talk about their new book, Smothermoss. I don't even know where to start on this, because when I first opened this book, I thought it was going to be one thing, and it turned out to be deliciously something else that is atmospheric and twisting and winding and feels a little bit like getting lost in the woods on a mountain in all the best ways. And I am so excited that people are going to be getting their hands on this and meeting these incredible characters. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, Jenna, thank you for having me. Really excited to be here.
I love this book and I love the premise, but I would love to start with you sort of describing this book, this setting, and these characters a little bit for us.
Yeah, sure. So Smothermoss is the story of two sisters, Sheila and Angie, who are growing up on a remote mountainside in 1980s Appalachia. But then when two female hikers are murdered on the Appalachian Trail really close to their home, life gets a lot harder and it kind of kicks off this chaos in the world around them. So there's danger and there's mystery and some secrets, a little bit of magic, and a whole lot of nature. I kind of think of it as haunted Appalachia, but maybe not haunted in quite the way that you'd expect.
I agree with that. I think there's sort of maybe an expectation or a preconceived notion of this setting of sort of being like, oh, this is Appalachian Gothic, or, oh, I know what that is. I've seen that before. And in some ways, that's true. There are pieces of that really ring through in Smothermoss and things that I'm like, oh, yeah, this feels like something I've heard before. And yet, it is a place that I think most people don't actually know that much about.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I also think that, so I'm talking about Northern Appalachia, which I think a lot of people tend to think about like Tennessee and Kentucky, but this is Pennsylvania. So, I mean, just culturally, there's a Mason-Dixon line. So like we don't have some of the Southern baggage, but then we have the geographic isolation, the sort of culture of people who depend on themselves and like folkways and like, eating from the forest and stuff like that. So I do think that there's definitely a difference between the specificity of the Appalachian world in Smothermoss and maybe just sort of what your mind goes to immediately.
And this setting was really almost a character in itself to me. Sometimes I feel like that sentence can get a little bit overblown to be like, the setting is a character. But the world is really alive in this book and has wills and needs and desires of its own and kind of has its own plan. And getting to sort of immerse ourselves in that world is really something that propels this book along and really moves us through. And I love to hear about sort of how you crafted this world.
Yeah, okay. So first of all, I'm really glad that came through to you as a reader because that's really important to me. I feel like in some ways it's a hard question for me to answer. How did I do it? Because for me, that was the easy part of the book, right? Like I grew up in that world. Like I just ran around barefoot all over these mountains in southern Pennsylvania. And the way that I related to the forest and the mountain and like even the rocks, like I have feelings and emotions towards them. I have a relationship. And so of course, when I talk about them, I think about them as real. I think it's sort of like the Velveteen Rabbit, like if you love something enough, it becomes real. And that applies to inanimate objects that are stuffed animals, but also entire landscapes.
There is a tactility in your writing that brings us like to that moment. I feel like often when we think about nature writing, it can get a little bit lofty and sort of too atmospheric or hard to connect to. But I think your writing is so focused on the like present moment of these characters encountering these things or this world being so alive. Like the way you described the rabbits throughout this book, I was like, I can't confirm or deny if I've ever actually held a rabbit, but now I feel like I have.
I mean, that's great. It's wonderful to hold a rabbit. We did have rabbits when I was growing up. And so I took care of them and stuff. But I feel oddly about it now that I'm an adult, I guess. I mean, like, I'm a vegetarian. So, like, looking back on the idea of raising rabbits for food, it's a little bit horrifying to me. So, all my mixed feelings about that sort of come out in how I describe them.
Yeah, Sheila, I feel like definitely has those mixed feelings as well as she's going through and being like, I hate these rabbits, but here I am back with the rabbits again. I think, too, so much of the descriptions of the physical objects sort of reframed my thinking of those things because we are forced to encounter them in the ways that Sheila and Angie are encountering them. And I think that is often very different than most of us have had a relationship to nature. Like you were saying, if you were growing up in it, if you are relying on it, there's a connection that feels so much deeper than just being like, ah, yes, I come to go hiking on this trail and I can wave to it and then go home. There's a difference when you rely on it, and in a way, it relies on you too.
Yeah, I mean, I think even though I live in an urban area now, I sort of sometimes forget that some people maybe have grown up entirely in cities and the suburbs. And so to them, like, nature is, if they think about it at all, is scenery, and it's something that's kind of static, that like it's a picture. And so to me, and this is definitely Sheila and Angie's relationship, is like they must interact with it all the time on an individual level, like from one day to the next, it's not the same. And so that affects, I don't know, what they do and how they live their lives.
I think you also capture very well this idea of sometimes the exact same things being helpful and being dangerous, and being able to navigate or not being able to navigate, knowing when that is the case.
Right. I mean, like, I tried to take that to a bigger canvas, but like something that would be really familiar to somebody who's like a gardener, right? It's like, oh, my garden needs rain, so I have crops. But like if it rains too much, it'll just destroy everything. So something that could protect you could also really harm you. And that's kind of fun to play with.
Especially when you sprinkle in that little bit of magic and you're talking about, and suddenly you're like, ooh, I'm not sure what's happening. I'm not sure if this is real. But at the same time, it never feels so outside the realm of possibility. And I think anyone who's like been truly outside in nature by themselves in the middle of a forest, in the middle of wherever, you know that things aren't, there's possibility for things to get a little weird.
I think that if you're a human alone in a wild landscape where there are no other people like within arm's reach, and let's say you don't have cell connection or anything, like you could yell and scream, no one's going to hear you. Like you're not necessarily in danger, but just that entire idea of being cut off and isolated. And then you start to feel that there's all these other things around you. Like your senses let you know that you're not in an empty room. I guess I'm really interested in what's there. Like, what are those things that I only half sense what's actually going on?
And in writing, I think so often we are very focused in one camp or the other, in like very, very like relatable, understandable, this is real and happens, or very fantastical and otherworldly. But I'm always, like you were saying, so interested about what happens when those things kind of meet. And this is such an interesting time period that you're playing around in as well for this kind of thing, where there's an advent of technology and people are starting to get more connected. There's a lot of sort of global concerns. Angie has a lot of very global concerns about her very small world. And I think it's an interesting place to sort of meet those worlds of, yes, you could still be completely isolated and living in this way, but there's starting to be more outside influences seeping in.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a little bit, I guess I'm a little bit younger than these characters are. So like it's a bit offset from my own experience. But living somewhere really remote at that time, like, yeah, we had television and radio, but like we got one station, like you didn't have lots of options. If you wanted information, it had to come from a book, which was probably in the library, but your library didn't have very many books, like you you did get things from the outside, but they were old and slow and really limited in scope. But at the same time, the messages that you do get were sort of more centralized or like more monolithic. So Angie's obsession with nuclear war and Rambo and like survivalism and stuff, I really remember that as just being so pervasive from the 80s that like there were mushroom clouds on the television all the time. You know, they were fictionalized, but it was in the air, so to speak.
I have just one of my favorite images from this book is Angie with the dish towel wrapped around her head, like running through the woods, because what a dream to be a kid just playing like that. I mean, and I know that obviously she has a lot of other things going through her mind and other goals that are, you know, a little lofty and maybe not quite what she should be doing with her time. But at the same time, just picturing that was probably one of my favorite parts.
That's awesome. That's great. She is sort of irrepressible.
The characters that you've created are so interesting and layered and have so much depth. As I was sort of navigating my way through this book, I would go back and forth between who I felt like I related to more or understood more or was more frustrated with. It's just a back and forth of all kinds.
Yeah. I think that I sort of came to that point as well. Like both characters have existed from the very beginning. I knew that there were going to be these two sisters and that they would be very different, both in appearance and character. But kind of in my head, it was Sheila's story, right? But like she was the center around which everything revolved. But then, and so that means that when I did write Angie, I was looking at her through Sheila's eyes, and Sheila doesn't like Angie. So I kind of didn't like her. But after a while, as she took up more space, like, I can't say I like her, but man, I respect her Angie-ness. Like, she is herself through and through.
I think that for both characters, there's no way, you know, having finished it, and obviously it's different when you're writing it and creating it, but I don't think there's a way you could like pull one out of the story and still have it hold all the things it needs to hold. There's so much between the two and the dynamic and just the places where they meet and bounce off each other. And the whole time I was kind of like, oh, if you could only see both of yourselves from the outside, you'd actually see how similar your struggles are in a weird way. But obviously when you're a kid and you're 5 years apart, there's no way you're going to see that.
Right. I mean, I think they do at least have one tiny moment of that recognition towards the end. I don't think it lasts very long, but they do get to have that.
I love that. I love that also the whole time both of those voices were there. So often I wonder when I'm talking to authors, like, you know, if some voice came through first or stronger or whatever, but I can see how there's really no point where these two can't exist without each other.
They play off each other, right? And like they are sort of deliberately two really different ways to be a girl in the world, and like both from the inside and the outside. So like what people put on you and perceive about you based on your appearance, and then also the way that you might feel as you interact with the world. You know, I wanted deliberately to show those things, that like it's not just one way.
They both are really set against expectations in so much of what they're doing, whether that's expectations from the outside or from their own, you know, expectations for themselves and who they think they should be, especially for Sheila, sort of this idea of what she thinks her life should be. And so often I just felt for her and I just wanted to like give her a hug and be like, it's going to be okay.
She wouldn't have let you hug her.
No, never. But I could have imagined her spirit. There is something I think so profound about the struggles that they're both going through, especially for Sheila and her trying to understand herself, her connection to femininity, her queerness, all of these things that are not easy to encounter at any stage of your life, but I imagine especially in her community in the 80s, you know, she's going through something that is heavy and that is represented in so many places of her life. And yet her strength is so pervasive, and I mean that in a a true way of like watching her be so vulnerable and have to just keep picking herself back up. I really enjoyed her arc so much as she comes to find herself through the book.
Okay, so I feel like this is a terrible thing to say about Sheila, but I think she's really good at suffering. But like that's part of her superpower. And it works against her in a lot of ways. I mean, it makes it possible for her to survive and to do the things that she does, but like she kind of, I almost want to say she takes a certain amount of like miserable pride in her ability to put up with things.
She does. I mean, I think so often when I think about her and maybe her relationship to food is like a great example of, thinking if you deny yourself, that means you're somehow stronger. If you choose these things to suffer. And I think a lot of people have had those moments where especially when you're young and you think, oh, this is just all it's ever going to be. And you can't quite realize yet that, no, there's going to be more.
I almost think that for Sheila, like if she didn't do something that this is all it's ever going to be would actually be true. Like her horizons are so limited that like, yes, she does have a chance to break out of that, but she can kind of see like the trajectory of her life ahead of her. Her options are limited, and it's not going to be a very comfortable life because it doesn't suit her. So if she doesn't find a way to, get some more elbow room of some kind, it isn't going to go very well for her.
I imagine too, looking at Angie, and part of her sort of struggle with her is watching her sister be able to make some of that elbow room or to not be as concerned in some of those ways with things. I mean, not to say Angie doesn't have her own struggles and her own concerns, but she is able to be a little bit more unapologetically herself. And it might be, I can imagine from Sheila's perspective, that might be a struggle to watch.
I think that you're right, that she can at least, Angie being like, 5 years younger, she can look at her older sister and be like, you're not doing this right. We always think that when we're younger, that the person who is older has clearly messed up. And if I had as much agency as you did, I wouldn't do the dumb things that you're doing. So Angie is very dismissive of the way Sheila handles things and thinks she's going about it all the wrong way. But, you get a certain latitude in being the younger child, too, that there are less responsibilities and less pressures and expectations put on you.
Yes. I'm an only child, so I get to do all the older and younger things all at once.
I was actually the youngest, so I should be more sympathetic to you.
I read something that you talked about in another interview with your extreme distaste for the idea of strong female characters. And I often feel the same way. I have the same thoughts on the phrase likable characters or likable women. And I think that your characters could easily, in many ways, be called unlikable, whatever that means, because they are real, because they're raw, because they have flaws that sort of ooze out of them that they're working on. But I think it's so interesting the way that we categorize what a female character must be in order to be palatable.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that when I was criticizing strong female characters, I am thinking first of movie characters, right?
Okay.
The character type is the same in the books and the movies, where it's sort of like a male hero character who fights and curses and kicks ass, but also looks really good. And so like that's where the movie part comes into it. I mean, actually, Angie and Sheila do, in the end, fight and kick ass, but they don't look real good while they're doing it. Like, it's hard, it's ugly, it's not assured that they're going to win, right? So I think that's the stuff that I think that when you really get into what it's like to fight on that level, like where you either really are or believe that you're fighting for your existence, that's not a glamorous fight.
And I think the expectation that we must portray women in this way, and not just women, to be honest, it's really all humans must be beautiful in all times, or the exact way we picture them has to be this epitome, this ideal. I mean, if you go into action movies, if you go into true crime, or, there is obviously there's an element of crime writing in this. There is a mystery, there's a murder. the victims must be a particular way in order to be perceived as worthy of discussion. And I think that comes through so often in writing, and it doesn't always help us navigate the way we actually feel about these characters.
Yeah. So one of the things when I was writing this, and this may seem sort of a weird thing to say since I'm a fiction writer and I'm making everything up, but when I would get stuck, I wasn't sure what I was going to do, my mantra to myself was just tell the truth, which meant like, don't try to shape what I'm trying to tell you about what's going on, just to be like as honest of a narrator as I can be about what's happening. Obviously, it's still fictionalized and it still has sort of a coloring or a style over it, but my intent was to be as bare about what I imagined the truth of that situation would be.
And I think that comes through, especially when we are looking at the reality of these characters' lives, and not just Angie and Sheila, but their mother, their women around them, the butch who owns the store, the old woman who lives with them, Thina, who I related to, I think, the most out of all the characters in this. I don't know. I think I'm just born to be an old woman who lives in a chair. But to sort of look at the reality of all of their lives and to watch how they interact with each other, it feels very like set before us in a way that is not glamorizing anything, but it's also not pitying them. It's just saying, here it is. This is what their life is.
Yeah, I mean, again, that's something I'm really glad to hear you say, because that's what I hope for. I mean, I think that when you're writing about people who are, let's say, less economically advantaged, that there's even a tendency towards like poverty porn, that like, oh, it's so terrible and everything. And like, it is hard in their situation, but there are also compensations, and so you take the good with the bad.
I think for these girls in particular, the freedom that is afforded to them and the agency that they are able to have because they know more about life. They are just a little bit more set in an advantage to take direction, take control, even though there's a lot of things playing against them in certain ways. They know how the world works in a way that I think some of the, kids who live in town or in a suburb may not know.
I mean, that's really interesting. I think that it's only effective when they're alone. So like they have all this knowledge that an agency that they can exercise when they're alone, and they are alone a lot. But then when they run up against the constraints of the world, then they're at a disadvantage because like they don't know those rules or those behaviors and they don't fit well into them. So if they stay in the place where they are, then they have knowledge and strength. If they try to go to another place, then they're the ones who are clueless.
It certainly puts us in the tension that comes up so often in the book. And then if you add in perhaps my favorite part in many ways, this magical overlay of like Angie's cards, Sheila's rope, these moments where things are happening, but we're not sure if they're actually happening. It puts just a filter over the top that just moves everything slightly to the side, and you have to really screw your eyes to know exactly where you're looking. And I wonder, was the magic always there? Did you know that that was going to be a part of the story from the beginning?
I think so, but not in any really specific way. I have always just really loved the weird and the unusual. And like, so not straight up magic, which, like I can enjoy a good fantasy story like anybody else. But my favorite things are when you're reading about something and it's like when you see something out of the corner of your eye and you're not sure if it's real and you're like, did that happen or not? And like, I just love that sensation. It gives me shivers. So I just leaned into that while describing things and let things emerge. Like I didn't know that the cards were going to be magic. So like I knew pretty early on that Angie was going to draw her monster cards, that they were just a thing that she did. They expressed their personality. Then I was like, oh, there's more to these cards than meets the eye, right? That there's something else going on. And so I think that that's what happened with all of the pieces of magicalness is that they spring from something that's already there, and then there's an extra layer to them.
I love this idea of a personal mythology that these girls carry and that this world carries, that like Angie's frankness of being like, I don't know what these cards are, I just do it, and then that's what it is, and I don't know. It's first of all, it's something only a 12-year-old would say, just being like, I don't know, I just do it. And also this idea that this is just how it always is, and it's not this big supernatural thing that she's necessarily afraid of or worried. It's just how it is. And I feel like that's so often with the things Sheila runs into as well, this idea of like, I think hers, she has a little bit more fear and apprehension about what she encounters, and you know, these visions or this, you know, weight that she carries with her. But it's just kind of like, you expect us to just get on board, and I love that.
I think that's, maybe it isn't this way for everybody, but I think that that's a lot of the experience of being a child, is that, you know, the world is happening around you and there are just all kinds of things, and you don't know which ones are normal and which ones aren't. I mean, even in a mundane world, you still don't know whether the thing that your family does, like every Saturday night, is what everybody else's family does. It's not until you get out and you talk to more people and you get some perspective and you compare notes that you're like, ooh, I guess that was kind of weird. Like, you don't know that. You just take things as they come. And I think because they're young and because they're isolated and because they've learned already that they're not like other people, then anything can be encompassed in the, I guess that's the way it is.
Especially when they're being told some wild and wacky stories from, you know, the people around them. And there's just these stories of, well, there was an old man, or not an old man, a man made of stone, and that's just, you just accept that. Or there's the girl who can't eat, you know, there's these stories that are sort of passed down in families. I think everyone's had that moment where someone in their family tells a story and you're like, that can't possibly be true. And they're like, no, that was Uncle so-and-so, and they did that.
Right. I mean, that's folklore and mythology, right? But sometimes people are telling a version of a story that's, you know, more broadly spread, and they've just got their own family recipe for it. But like, sometimes families have their own like very specific littleness. And like, I think sometimes they're supporting a belief that the family's trying to pass down, but sometimes you just have some characters in your larger family who look at things differently and want to tell you all about it.
I love that. And I think the girls really, I wonder, like, you know, what happens. I mean, first of all, one of my biggest things is when I finish a book, I just hope that the characters are going to be okay. Like, I'm always like, I can't imagine. I know sometimes you just can't keep thinking down a road. You're like, the book's done. I have to just let that sit. But I'm always like, I hope they're okay. But I also wonder what stories they're going to tell someday.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah. How might it morph as they tell it? What would they reveal and what would they keep to themselves? And what are they going to exaggerate? Angie is definitely going to be boasting about some of the things that happened and the very big, very important role that she had to play in it. Sheila might eventually confess to a very close, intimate friend.
She's going to be talking about her own personal role in the Cold War and what she did to protect America with one step at a time.
Yeah.
I love that. I love the imagery of everything that they tell. I love the imagery on the book jacket. It's one of those things that it just so perfectly, as soon as I saw it, I was like, oh, that's it.
Yeah, it is a beautiful, beautiful cover. I really lucked out. They showed it to me and I was like, yep, okay. You know, I didn't have any complaints.
It's like that, along with the header images and the chapter titles. I was like going back through and rereading the chapter titles after I finished the book to like get a better understanding. So I feel like, I was like, well, I need to know, because once I finish the chapter, then I'll understand why the title was what it was.
I mean, the chapter titles are Angie's card, right? They're something that was in the deck at one point.
And I love it. I feel like there's always those kid things of being like, I remember, you know, like a weird story you write or a picture you draw, and you would be like, what would I think about that now if I could see and read everything I made as a kid?
That might be slightly horrifying and very embarrassing. But yeah, I mean, on the other hand, you might be just like, wow, like I was really inventive when I was a kid and I didn't think that I was.
I think, you know what, the things that are lost to time are the things that are meant to be lost to time.
Probably true.
I wonder, too, as I was reading this and just getting so lost in the world, some of your literary influences, things that either have just shaped you as a writer or things that you thought about when writing this book, sort of all the books that make you, you.
Yeah, okay. So I read really widely and always have, just like gobbling up everything I could, especially because when I started reading, which was really young, it was limited, right? So there wasn't the internet and I couldn't just have anything I wanted all the time. So the fact that things were limited made it seem possible to read all of it. And I was going to try, but more specific interests. So I like fantasy and science fiction and historical and lit fic and classics and just like everything. If it speaks to me, then it's a good book. One influence, I think, it's Sarah Waters, the historical novelist, because she's so good at showing all the different ways in which it's possible to be a woman and women's relationships with each other, both romantic and platonic, and like in different time periods. But she also goes into the spooky. I mean, there's The Little Stranger and Affinity, where you kind of don't know what is and isn't. So I just admire her so much. Going back to when we were talking about strong female characters, this is an influence that I didn't realize was an influence until after I was pretty much finished, and that's Linda Barry, the cartoonist. I feel like Angie and Sheila are like Marlis and Maple. Like they are kids the way that they really are, and they are kind of ugly and a bit gross and kind of raw, but funny and sad and honest and tragic, like everything all at once. Before I wrote this book, I did actually have a chance to work with Linda twice. And the way she talked about creation, I want to say like writing, but also just creating art in any way, was really transformative to me and probably allowed me to write this book in the way that I wanted to. So I think that I would definitely credit that as an influence. And I've always been a big fan of Haruki Murakami and like the way things are surreal and you just sort of start in this dream sequence and weird things are happening and you don't know why and they're never explained, but you just follow on. You go to the next step and you go to the next weird thing and you just go with them. So that covers, and crime fiction. I do love crime fiction, especially sort of like British ones that are very atmospheric and where the setting is a big part of the mood of it. And it's all about why people are the way they are. I can read, that's my comfort read.
I love that. I love to see how all those threads come together and like weave their way in and leave their little mark on Smothermoss. And yet it is a thing all in itself and holds so many other things that I can't wait for people to get their hands off because I think they're really going to love what they find. They're going to love Sheila and Angie, even when they don't always agree with what they do or they go, oh my God, please be okay. But I think that it's going to be something really wonderful. So thank you so much for being with us today and talking with us about Smothermoss.
Thank you, Jenna.
Hi, readers. It's time for another TBR Top Off. We're going to recommend a couple of great books to pick up when you stop in for your copy of Smothermoss. I'm Mark at my Barnes & Noble in Cincinnati, and I'm joined today by one of my favorite book buddies, Mary, down in Texas. Hi, Mary. I'm going to have you kick things off. How are you?
I'm good, Mark. So when I was thinking about Smothermoss, I was reading part of the synopsis on it and then the inside cover, and of course, read the book. And there was a line that stuck with me, and it says, "Mountains that sigh and monsters that are made of ink." And when I read that, I knew that my TBR top off would be The Cemetery of Untold Stories by Julia Alvarez. Now, this book came out earlier this year. She wrote In the Time of Butterflies, which I read in college. And as soon as I found out a new book was coming out of hers earlier this year, I grabbed it. The story picks up with the author, Alma Cruz, is grappling with her father's death and the aging of herself. And she has this friend who she's grown up with. They both were authors. They both came through at the same time. They both were professors. And her friend fell too far into her stories, and her friend's in the hospital. And Alma does not want a similar fate. So Alma decides to kind of take matters into her own hands, and she's deciding what to do with her papers and her untold stories. So she has an inheritance of property in the Dominican Republic from her father, and she decides that she's going to make a cemetery for her untold stories and her unfinished stories. So she builds a cemetery, and she has an artist fund who builds all the untold stories, markers and gravestones. And with the markers and gravestones, they each represent a different character or a plot point in the book. They could be a globe, they could be a dictator, different things like that. To get into the cemetery, you have to tell Alma a story. So Philomena, the caretaker, tells Alma a story, and she becomes the caretaker. And what Alma doesn't know is that Philomena has a nephew that lives in the United States, and he's been wanting to interview Alma for years. And when he realizes that his aunt has access to Alma Cruz, he comes down there. He's like, hey, can I talk to her? And she's like, nope, you cannot. So, but one day Philomena is just telling this grave marker her problem. She's just talking to the universe, and the grave marker answers her, and they talk to each other. And it got a beautifully intertwined stories. Just, it's fantastical. But do stories ever really die? And what is Alma's imagination and what is an actual reality? So it is a beautiful book. I highly recommend it. And my pick for TBR Top Off is The Cemetery of Untold Stories by Julia Alvarez.
Fantastic. And Alvarez is sort of a mistress of magical realism. Mm-hmm. She can tap into it in a beautiful, beautiful way, and has some like sort of spooky elements, really just beautiful and lyrical writing, which I think works really well for Smothermoss too. I was thinking about Smothermoss in the way that there is something so intimidating and mystical about rural Appalachia. And there's just this huge growth of fiction coming out that's tapping into this energy that is very, very thrilling. And Smothermoss does this really, really well. And it brought to mind a book that I read recently called Revelator by Daryl Gregory. Ooh, this book. It is, at its core, is a Southern Gothic, but it does some interesting tweaks to the genre that are really welcoming. The setting is backwoods Tennessee in the 1930s. You have family and generational conflict and trauma, and you have absolutely horrifying secrets that unfold with very excellent pacing. So the book follows a woman named Stella, who is a bootlegger. She is returning home for her grandmother's funeral. And while she's there, she becomes re-entangled with her family's connection to this kind of cult-like worship of this god that lives in a cave. Feels like a lot, is a lot, but in a wonderful way. The book is wild, it is haunting, it has some really messed up, amazing moments, but it really takes its time. And that's one thing that I really loved about the book, is that the pacing worked so well. All of these nightmarish things that crop up are always very, very earned. I think the plot is just really intricate, but I think more importantly, Gregory does a really excellent job of fully realizing his characters, especially his female characters, and especially Stella. The voices are really well thought out, really lived in, and that just makes all of the messed up stuff that happens that much more effective. This book is perfect for a sweaty summer. It tastes like damp stone and mud and moonshine and blood and sweat, and it is brilliant. So check out Revelator by Daryl Gregory. But that's all we have for today. Thanks so much for tuning in to Poured Over. Please make sure to give us a rating and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. You can also follow us on our socials at Barnes & Noble. I'm Mark. You can follow my home store at BN Westchester. Mary, where can we find you?
You can follow me at my home store at BN Beaumont TX.
All right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Happy reading. Bye.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.